We've been joined this evening by Dr. James Slater from the University of Buckingham to discuss sanity in infancy and insanity, more particularly for my research for my EPQ, which is titled "Is Claiming Insanity a Loophole for Criminals?" Would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, thank you very much, Georgina. Yes, my name is James Slater. I'm a reader in law at the University of Buckingham, and I specialise in criminal law theory, and I did my PhD in criminal law theory, and I continue to research in criminal law theory, including things like issues of criminal responsibility, i.e. why is it that people are answerable to the criminal law, which is exactly what your EPQ sounds like it's about, and also, in that sense, addressing issues like, is it a loophole or a way out for people? In my personal opinion, to answer your question already, I don't think it is. If anything, I think it might be the opposite. But if I do a whistle-stop tour through the law now, we can then start to dialogue about that question.
Yeah, of course.
So, I'll go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So, I'll make this as quick as possible. And that was my reminder to be here, so that's perfect. Sanity, insanity. So insanity, insanity, you might think are the two sides of the same coin. Yes.
Yeah.
So in sense of if you're not held to be insane, then for the purposes of that inquiry, you are sane. Right?
Yeah.
So if you don't satisfy the criminal law's definition of insanity, you are criminally sane.
Yeah.
Yes. So, but what I'm going to do first is put the notion of sanity a little bit into context, right? Or flesh it out a little bit, because there's more than one dimension to it, right? The first type of sanity is cognitive sanity, which is your ability to understand the world around you. Yes. Why do you know that phone in your hand is hard?
Yeah.
How can you tell?
Because I can feel it.
Feel it. So your senses feed information to you. When you see steam coming off water, what do you assume?
It's boiling.
Boiling, exactly. So that's your cognitive capacities, right?
Yeah.
The abilities to interpret the world factually, accurately around you, okay? And that's one form of sanity that we're all highly dependent on. The other type of sanity might call impulse control sanity, addiction. So what do you think the problem is with addiction?
Like, people can't really stop themselves.
Yeah, exactly. So they know what they ought to do, but they've got these impulses.
Yeah.
Very powerful sometimes, arguably overwhelming. And so to have impulses at a normal pitch of intensity and to have the ability to control them is something that is jeopardized by addiction, for example. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
So that's another form. So, of sanity is cognitive, then it's faculty of self-control. And then the last one, which is perhaps the most interesting one, is moral sanity, which is, so if you walking down the road and you see somebody insulting somebody else, attacking them on the basis of race or religion, for example, you would consider that immoral, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But you've learned to recognize it as immoral. In other words, you hear the words, you see the behavior, and your brain says this is something that's wrong. This shouldn't happen. Now, that's nothing to do with your cognitive sanity, because that's to do with just the fact that you can see a person, that it's daytime, that you're on a pavement. It's nothing to do with, you're not resisting any impulse, but what you are doing is interpreting the world morally. Yes?
Yeah.
And you're able to understand the moral features and dimensions of something. Yes? So these are the three facets of insanity.
Yeah.
And the question, really, to a certain extent, is to what extent does criminal insanity, how does it feed off those concepts? Which ones is it interested in, and which ones isn't it? And if it's interested in a lot of them, it might start to look like a loophole because it creates too many opportunities.
Yeah.
Am I making sense?
Yeah, completely.
If it has a narrower definition, then maybe it's not a loophole. It might even be too harsh because it doesn't embrace enough of the problems that people have, psychological and what have you. So that's moral sanity. So the last thing I want to say about moral sanity is psychopaths. Do you have any idea what do you think a psychopath is?
Like someone who isn't maybe I'm not correct. Like they're not sympathetic. They don't understand. They can't
exactly.
read the situation.
Do they understand guilt? Do they have guilt?
No.
No, they have no guilt. So do you think they're cognitively insane, impulse insane, or morally insane? Which three, just out of interest?
Yes, morally insane.
Absolutely right. They're morally insane.
Uh-huh.
They understand the world around them. They know that the tea is hot. They know they can make plans, for example, but they have no understanding of the moral dimensions. And a lot of their insanity, if you like, a version of it, is through their emotional insanity, because they lack all the normal emotional reactions one has when one does something wrong, like guilt and shame and remorse.
Yeah.
So I've just got some definitions of psychopathology, because I think they're great definitions, right?
Yeah.
So one of them is, it says here, the psychopath is incapable of kindness and consideration for the rights of others. And he is lacking in gratitude, affection, and compassion, for example. And another one we have here, the psychopath can commit the most appalling acts, yet view them without remorse. The psychopath has a warped capacity for love. His emotional relationships, when they exist, are meagre, fleeting, and designed to satisfy his own desires.
Yeah.
So now we've painted a quick landscape of the various forms of sanity, and we've looked at one way that you can be insane, which is like a psychopath. So, children, this is one that we just want to get quickly. Do you know what the age of criminal responsibility is, by any chance? It's up there on the screen, of course.
Oh, I've just looked and said
Fantastic.
It's 10 years old.
That was the whole point. Very good, 10.
Yes.
So if you're once you're 10, you're answerable for your criminal behaviour. Up until that age, you're not.
Yeah.
And that's quite interesting. Why do you think children are off the hook? Is it a loophole, Georgina, or does it make sense to you?
Yeah, I feel like, obviously, as like when you're younger, you're kind of being taught what's right and wrong.
Yeah.
So you're less likely to kind of know what is right and wrong in a moral sense.
Yes, your knowledge is slowly developing.
Yeah.
And also maybe you've got other incapacities. What about impulse control, for example? Do children surrender to impulse?
Probably not.
Well, I think they do. Well, my daughter does. I mean, the minute she sees something like chocolate, her hand goes out without any sense of, oh, maybe I shouldn't.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. So what the idea with children is that they're at a sort of very, they're not insane. Children aren't insane, right?
Yeah.
They're not irrational. They're just under-rational. So they're developing. So what the criminal law says there is that they're off the hook, to use a colloquialism, up until 10. Now, you might disagree with where that age should be. You might think it should be 12, you might think it should be 14. But the law's got to draw a line somewhere, and that's where it draws the line.
Yeah.
Yes. So that just deals with children. Here's the insanity defence. Are you familiar with the McNaughton Rules?
Yeah. I've done research into them.
Fantastic.
As one of my stuff.
You know it wasn't a case. You know it was actually just like a press release.
Yeah.
It wasn't actually in reaction to a case. They were asked, the House of Lords, Supreme Court of the land, was asked to make a statement with regard to what the expectations were of sanity, criminal insanity. And this is what they came up with.
Yeah.
Okay. And they said that in order to succeed, the defendant, so the obligation is on the defendant. Did you know that it's the burden of proof is on the defendant in this case? Normally it's on the prosecution. And the prosecution have to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that you're guilty of the offence. But if the defence has to raise insanity as a defence, and then they have to prove on the balance of probabilities that the person was insane. So the reverse burdens do exist in the criminal law. They're relatively rare, but they do exist. And by reverse burden, just to repeat, I mean that the burden is on the defendant to establish something, not on the prosecution to establish something. And so, in order to succeed with the defendant must establish on the balance of probabilities that he was suffering from a disease of the mind, giving rise to a defect of reason that negates his knowledge, the nature and quality of the act, or knowledge that the act is wrong.
Yeah.
Do you know the first one? Can you think of an example of the first one? Not to know the nature and quality of what you are doing.
Not to know. In what sense, like?
Well, that's fine. I'm happy to explain.
Oh, like they
well,
don't.
It's cognitive.
They
you know the three I spoke of: cognitive.
Oh yeah.
Impulse.
So they don't know that. I don't know.
Do you think is it cognitive? Is it impulse, or is it moral insanity? They do not know the nature and quality of the act.
Cognitive.
Very good. spot on.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So we won't bother with. I mean, disease of the mind is an interesting concept, right? Because there are lots of problems with mental functioning that you might not label as a disease of the mind. I'm not, in one sense, I'm not, but they want it to be a disease of the mind, so the disease of mental functioning, right?
Yeah.
And that embraces things like even an epileptic seizure, believe it or not, right? Because it concerns mental functioning. Whereas I'm not sure the medical profession would consider that
as
insanity.
Insanity, yeah.
But the nature and quality of the act, there's a very famous example from Professor Kenny from back in the day. He says the madman who cuts a woman's throat under the idea that he's cutting a loaf of bread.
So he doesn't understand
the nature and quality.
Yeah, completely.
Now that's very
extreme.
Well, it's what's called psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
Psychotic.
Yeah.
Now people misuse the term psychotic and they confuse it with psychopathology. Right. Psychopathology is the psychopath, the morally insane.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not psychotic. They understand that this is a sofa. They understand that's a cup of tea.
Yeah.
Right. But psychosis is hearing voices. So they, or thinking that somebody's neck is
a loaf of bread. Yeah.
So that's the benchmark. I don't like using Americanisms, but I will.
Mm-hmm.
The bar.
Yeah.
Is set at psychosis. So in the spirit of is it a loophole or not? My position would be, well, that's a very high standard to satisfy. And if you do understand the world cognitively, you're criminally sane, even though you may have a host of other moral and other types of psychological difficulties.
Yeah.
And the other one is you've got to know that the act, or you just don't know it's wrong. So now there's been a recent case which called Keel, which has made clear now that you have to know both that it's not against the law and that it's not morally wrong either. So you've got to commit the act thinking two things: this is not against the law, and it's not immoral either.
Surely it's quite hard to prove.
Yeah, exactly.
That, yeah.
This is why I'm thinking about your point about loophole. It's the standard is you've got to be, to use a colloquialism and not to disrespect what is a very serious matter, you've got to be very crazy.
Yeah.
Very crazy to be criminally insane. We'll just pause there. Why do you think criminal insanity might not match medical insanity?
Isn't it like, I feel like because they've got kind of like, they want different outcomes out of it.
Yeah, that's right. They're trying to do different things.
Yeah.
And because they're trying to do different things, they will have different definitions.
Yeah.
And an interesting question for the law generally, as well as the criminal law, is that law is parasitic. Do you understand what I mean by that?
No.
Well, it feeds off other disciplines.
Yeah.
And it uses concepts from other disciplines. So criminal law uses concepts like intention, which is the psychological concept. It uses emotions like fear and anger in its definitions.
Yeah.
So those concepts exist outside of the law. Psychology has a definition of fear. Psychology has a definition of anger. Psychology has a definition of sanity and also of intention. The criminal law sort of looks at these concepts, right? So it has a look at them and says, well, we'll take that bit of it, but not that bit, and we'll adapt it, use it for our own purposes. One more very difficult question. Why do you think the law acknowledges insanity in any form? Because arguably the insane are dangerous.
Yeah.
So in one sense, incarceration, imprisonment in some general term might be the right thing. So why do you think the criminal law is even interested?
Because, like, the circumstances are different, I guess, and like, maybe it's like, if they don't know that what they're doing is wrong, maybe they need to maybe going to prison or may not be the exact place to find out.
That's again very good answer. So yes, if you take the purpose of punishment to be rehabilitation, how can you rehabilitate somebody who has no understanding? Yes, exactly. So what you've done there is you've taken it very well. Actually, you've taken a purpose of punishment, and you've reversed engineered that back into why the criminal law is interested in the concept. And what you've identified is it might be for reasons other to do with why medicine is interested in insanity. Medicine is interested in insanity more generally because it's concerned with, well-being, human flourishing, and also societal dangers. But that's exactly right. And this is why the criminal definition of insanity is narrower than the medical definition, because, as you pointed out, they're trying to do different things.
Yeah.
So this is what I've written in a quote of mine. I've said the threshold is not demanding. In the absence of radical cognitive impairment, preventing understanding of the factual nature of behaviour, or the very narrow incapacity to understand regulation by law, the agent is sufficiently normatively competent for the purposes of the criminal law. Which is just a fancy way of saying they're sane enough for the criminal law, even if they might not be sane enough. Do you have a question? Is that a...
No, it's good. I'm going to keep going.
Why are psychopaths criminally sane then?
Because they know, like, they're cognitive and like...
And do you think... So the argument goes, because some people dispute this, if the psychopath sees the policeman at the corner, will he or she desist?
No. What does desist
mean? Stop.
No.
They
or would they?
Yeah, because they don't want to be caught.
Yeah.
So this is another commentator, David Shoemaker says, for psychopaths, it is only considerations of penalties that prevent their wrongdoing. And this is surely enough to make them members of the legal community. Can you deter a psychopath?
Yes.
You point a gun to their head and say, stop. They'll stop.
Yeah. But only when the consequences are...
So, because they fear punishment. They don't want to be thwarted. They don't want to be... They want to get away with it.
Mm-hmm.
They do go a long time without being caught sometimes. I'm moving into territory that I'm not an expert on, because this is a criminological and sociological question. But from an amateur point of view, you know, my own amateur exposure to is that they can go a long time without being caught.
Yeah.
And so what Shoemaker says is the fact that they are aware of the penalty and they know it's illegal and will stop is enough to make them criminally sane.
Yeah.
Even though they are medically insane.
Insane, yeah.
Or morally insane. So to sort of, because I know you want to ask some questions now.
Yeah.
In my initial reaction to the premise of your question is that it's not a loophole.
Yeah.
And that actually our prisons are full of people who meet the threshold of criminal sanity but have a host of psychological and other mental health issues.
Yeah.
But they're not enough. They might be addressed at sentencing.
Yeah.
But they won't be addressed at conviction. So that's the intro. So,
yeah. Thank you very much.
Not at all.
So my first question is, usually in like what part of like the case and like when they're determining the verdict, like is insanity like usually decided or brought up?
Well, I'm not a criminal procedural expert.
Yeah.
So the caveat to my answer is I'm using a certain measure of intelligent guesswork here, and it would be something you would want to look at more closely. I will say that it's important perhaps to distinguish between insanity relative to the moment when the crime was committed to the additional question of insanity at trial.
Yeah.
Or fitness to plead. So fitness to plead, so you were perfectly sane, say, when you committed the crime, but by the time trial comes, you have become, in some sense, materially fitness to plead, which, again, using memory more than anything, you know, if you have to be able to understand the plea, you have to understand the procedure. If your mind is no longer, then the question of fitness to plead comes up. With regard to the question of insanity at the moment of the crime itself, again using intelligent guesswork, but I know that the burden of proof is on the defendant. My understanding would be that the defence would raise the matter of insanity. Insanity can be raised by the judge. If the judge thinks that insanity is beginning to play out in the evidence, the judge can bring it into the equation. In fact, there have been cases, at least historically, where the judge has said, well, this sounds like insanity, and sometimes people have pled guilty rather than to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. We could maybe talk a little bit about why people prefer to be found guilty than mad.
Yeah.
But so the defence would raise it, and they would have evidence of insanity. It's statistically relatively rare. I haven't got the latest stats, but there are relatively few insanity verdicts during the course of any 1 year, and it's the full verdict is not guilty by reason of insanity, which then raises a number of different options for the judge to undertake.
Yeah.
Instead of incarceration.
And like, you kind of like obviously, so like, how does like insanity, like obviously we talked about kind of like prison, people going to prison and stuff. Like, how does that have like like, how does claiming not guilty by reason of insanity like have the effect? Like, what usually happens to the
well, again, this is
defendants?
a criminological question, sociological question, which you can follow up, but using intelligent guesswork and my knowledge generally is that what happens is that the judge has a range of not sentencing options, because once you're not guilty by reason of insanity, punishment is off the table, and it becomes a question of the best outcomes from you in order to address that. So I do know it was diminished responsibility, was not insanity, but with the Nottingham, did you hear about the Nottingham stabbings? The 2 students who were stabbed in Nottingham by the person who was clearly had psychosis, and he was found. He didn't plead. Insanity didn't run in the end, but he did plead diminished responsibility, or at least it was accepted. Yeah. And so that opened up. He was actually put into, I'm not using the right language here, but a permanent care, medical care. And so his future then is dependent on being cured as opposed to serving his sentence. So the answer is not guilty by reason of insanity will enable the court to react to that person's medical issue as opposed to punishing them.
And you said that like you think that like it's not so more of a loophole, but actually it's quite like strict.
Yes, in my opinion.
And do you think, is there any like anyone in particular, or like any cases recently that you think or have been discussed like that have been too strict on?
Well, I mean, Keele, the recent case of Keele, for example, is an example where the person was clearly, he thought he was, I must get it right, he thought he was the devil, or he thought his victims were the devil. Right? But he also, when he was killing them, he said, I'm sorry. Yeah. Which revealed, supposedly, that he understood it was immoral. So, there's an old story, it's not true, but it's an old joke, which is the idea of the judge being, the person saying to the judge in the time of the death penalty, I did it because God told me to. And the judge says, well, I'm going to hang you unless God tells me not to. So you can see the lack of sympathy. Yeah. The idea being that it doesn't matter who told you or what you thought you were doing. If you knew it was illegal and you knew it was wrong. Yeah. So that's where the harshness. Now, is it possible for issues of mental ability, capacity, to work their way into other areas of law? Yeah. Such that the criminal law is more sensitive to these issues. Yes, I will give you an example. Sexual offences. Yeah. You have to have a reasonable belief in consent. So in other words, if the defendant says, I honestly believed that the other person was consenting, that's not good enough anymore. That belief must be genuinely held, and it must be reasonably held. Yeah. So now why? The answer is because we're not interested in people running the argument, well, I'm just so fabulously attractive, they must have, or because of what they were wearing or how they were behaving, this means they must be consenting, or they looked at me earlier in the evening and smiled at me. This is not good enough. So the belief must be reasonable. But I'm supervising a research project now where we're looking at the impact of autism on the ability to form reasonable belief. Now, the idea behind autism, in very generic terms, is often it impacts on the ability to read social signals, understand facial expressions, forms of communication, etc. So it could very easily impact on somebody's belief in consent because they lack. The autism impacts on their ability to understand
Yeah.
What somebody who's not non-neurodiverse or neuronormal, for want of a better expression, person wouldn't. So there, a mental something that impacts on your mental faculties. There is the cases have acknowledged that maybe they would acknowledge that.
Yeah.
So you're not criminally insane, but the fact that you're autistic, which would not satisfy criminal insanity.
Yeah.
But the fact that you're autistic can be imported into the criminal law in other ways through whatever principle you're dealing with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. Like, so I did some research into a case about a man who committed a crime while sleepwalking.
Oh yes.
So do you think that's kind of
you've raised what you've raised there is automatism.
Yeah.
Okay, automatism is another defence. It does exist. So automatism is a defence that says that if there is a complete dislocation between mind and body, then the person is no longer acting. And if they're not acting, they haven't committed the crime because it's not them.
Yeah.
If you were on a bus and the bus suddenly lurched to the right, and you, as a result of that, you bumped into somebody very hard and bruised their arm, right? Is that something you did, or is that an event that happened to your body?
Event that happened.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, by the same token, an epileptic seizure.
Yeah.
And you smash a vase, or you punch somebody in the face while you're having the seizure. The idea behind automatism, it's no longer you.
It's out of your control.
Yes, ultimately that's what it's about. It's out of your control. I mean, out of control is dangerous because you might suggest that somebody with an impulse disorder is out of control as well.
Yeah.
So out of control is a danger. It's a particular way of being out of control, whereby the direct control your mind has over your body has been utterly broken by the condition. So the question that people ask is sleepwalking like automatism? Well, sleepwalking isn't like an epileptic seizure, not entirely, because it's more like, I think of it like being in standby mode on your television.
Okay.
I mean, have you seen somebody sleepwalk ever?
Yes, I have.
They can do some things. Have you noticed? They can open doors, they can hold a conversation for a little while.
Yeah.
So they're not like they're not
kind of like
not having a seizure. They're more in a sort of reduced standby. They've got some function. The question with that would be simply, are they sufficiently in standby mode that you no longer think it's them? Are they no longer? That's the $64 million question. But it's not insanity. And interestingly, you probably would agree, I don't think people would treat sleepwalking as a madness.
Yeah.
But it's more of a functional problem, yeah.
And then obviously more in your PowerPoint you talked about like the irresistible impulse.
Yes.
Kind of like, what do you think, like how do you really classify an irresistible impulse? Like how would, like, you know that I was gonna go do something and it wasn't, and I could say that I didn't actually, I couldn't resist it.
Well, it's, again, you're asking all the right questions. What I think underlying your question is, to what extent do you associate with your impulses anyway?
Yeah.
I mean, for example, you know, do you love a sport in particular? Yeah.
I play lacrosse.
Lacrosse, right.
Yeah.
So let's say you loved lacrosse and you were passionate about it. You would hardly say that you had that you succumbed to an irresistible impulse to play lacrosse.
Yeah.
Because lacrosse is something you identify with, isn't it? It's something you want to do. It's you in action. You love it, you do it. So where your question is very good is, well, how do we know which impulses we identify with the agent and which impulses we treat as alien?
Yeah.
Which ones are alien? Ones so that the person can plausibly say, it wasn't me, it was the impulse, an alien feature of my psychological makeup. It's a difficult question.
Yeah.
Clearly, when people have impulses, like addiction, they do try to compartmentalize their mind. They say, well, that wasn't me. The bit about the gambling wasn't me. That was the addiction. Same with alcohol. When inhibition goes to alcohol, they say, it wasn't me, it was the alcohol. Right?
Yeah.
The answer, I think, comes back to people have better judgment, I think. So people, in what one philosopher, Gary Watson, said, in cool, calm, reflective moments, they have things that they believe in, that they subscribe to. You know, their value system, their character in one
Yeah.
sense. The one answer is irresistible impulses are those impulses that you reject in moments of calm reflection. That, in other words, you think, no, I don't. That's not something that I believe in. It's not something that I subscribe to. I'm just experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're experiencing it very powerfully, like you do with certain forms of impulse control disorders or with addiction, you are plausibly suggesting that you've been overwhelmed by something else. That's a long answer, sorry.
No, don't worry. It's like, do you think, like, murdering someone or like
Yes.
Is so severe that it can be classified as an impulse?
Well, as far as the criminal law is concerned, so what?
Yeah.
You're still a murderer, as we've discovered. Well, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, do people commit? Is murder always weakness of will? I mean, some people clearly are committed murderers.
Yeah.
For those people, crimes. What used to be things like crimes of passion, which was the old-fashioned expression for maybe killing somebody in a fit of jealousy.
Yeah.
That story you're telling, that narrative is plausible. But I'm afraid the criminal law is not sympathetic to that.
Yeah.
It might be sympathetic at sentencing. So because when you're sentenced, mandatory life sentence for murder, but the judge has to set a tariff period, which is how long you serve before you're eligible for evaluation for release.
Yeah.
And if, maybe if there is some very plausible story that shows that you will succumb to overwhelming pressure, or as what happens with some doctors, for example, they administered too much painkiller to alleviate suffering, for example, then under those circumstances the tariff might be lower.
Yeah.
But yes, so that story, you can run that story, but you're going to have to run it at sentencing, not a conviction.
And are there any like famous cases that people have like successfully been found not guilty by reason of insanity that specifically stick out to you?
Well, the only one I can refer to now that's in the public eye and has been is not involving insanity. It's involving the partial defence to murder, diminished responsibility. And that's the Nottingham stabbings, where he was found guilty of manslaughter as opposed to murder. And that people have reacted, the press has reacted very negatively to that in some elements of the press. And those reactions are, to a certain extent, based, in my opinion, on a misunderstanding. First of all, he was found guilty of manslaughter. Second, so it's not like he wasn't found guilty of a crime, but people had trouble understanding, there is subtlety involved in this, and there is the devil is always in the detail, and things may, the family have got their concerns, legitimate concerns, which they're entitled to express. But that is an example, to keep your answer simple, that's an example where it has attracted a lot of media attention, and people have reacted either positively or negatively to that outcome, and based on whether they think, that was the right outcome.
Yeah. So do you think, obviously this is quite a broad question, but like the media does have like quite, if it does get out, like this case, it can have an effect, like in kind of what happens, and
well, it can have effect, because law reform only happens when there's pressure.
Yeah.
And you always need pressure and public pressure as well. I do think, choosing my words carefully here, I do think that the media is always at the risk of oversimplifying things. Yeah. And portraying things in a way that might be more sensational or lacking the subtlety that the truth has. And in that sense, questions of the diminished responsibility defence and the insanity defence are at risk of being misrepresented to the public. Yes.
Yeah.
And it can look like somebody's benefited from a loophole, whereas it may not be the case.
Yeah. And like, kind of, do you think there's, like, obviously where you are now with all the knowledge you have, you think that there might be in the future, like, what the route of insanity is going to take? Like, well,
I have argued in the past in my own writing that they need to incorporate issues with impulse control. That they need a defence that acknowledges the problems that acute problems one can have with self-control.
Yeah.
And so I'm not alone in thinking that the law of insanity needs developing.
Yeah.
But the general consensus is that it needs developing to include more conditions, not fewer. There is always the risk when you broaden defences in criminal law that you make available avenues for people to game the system, which lies under, in a sense, your title is expressing that suspicion in one sense. So the law has to strike this very difficult balance between acknowledging the moral complexity and psychological complexity of crime.
Yeah.
But whilst at the same time not being so forgiving or opening up too many possible that people will start to game the system.
Yeah.
So it's striking that delicate balance. But I think there is place definitely to broaden the concept to deal with certain issues of self-control, yes.
So do you think like that balance will ever be reachable, or?
I think the law, it's a good question. I think the law will eternally struggle.
Yeah.
And it's partly because criminal law is not just an idea in a book. It's a system that's administered by people. So there's the Crown Prosecution Service, there's expert witnesses, there's the police. So when humans are involved, there is always, this possibility of people can be extremely well-meaning, but people just get ground up in the system, and injustices occur, and then there's a kind of, not a backlash, but then there's change, and then people feel this pendulum swung too far the other way, and I think that sort of to and fro will continue forever, but the path to a better future is certainly investment in criminal justice infrastructure and professionalisation. There's another issue, I'm digressing, gross negligence manslaughter, for example, which is a very sort of abstract crime that depends on a lot of jury discretion. There's some people have suggested we need specialist courts to deal with those, and same way as with fraud, complex economic fraud. Well, that needs investment. You have to invest in specialist courts. You have to, so, I think that sort of struggle between individual justice and the needs of the system and the public's reaction to that will go on forever. Yes.
Well, I'm done with my questions.
Well,
but thank you very much.
They were very good questions. Thank you. I hope I helped a little.
Yeah, I think they did very much, and
I'm glad.
I'm excited to use them in my
very
essay.
Good.
Thank you so much.